Hi, I'm Reverend Jeff Snyder, and I wanted to come talk to you today about an epiphany I had while out watching the birds. I got interested in bird watching while I was exercising, taking long walks, while the gym's been closed. Had to do something. Our dog, our aging beagle, Daisy, she's 17 years old, and she doesn't sleep very well now, and she gets up around 5 a.m., and I've reached an age where when I'm woken up, I'm up. So I'm up at 5 as well. Decided to take advantage of that. Get dressed, go out for a walk, first thing in the morning. And so that's what I've been doing. And I take a camera with me so that I can go bird watching and take a little photography. So, taking some nature shots as well, but I settled on the birds because the birds were really interesting me. And, well, I learned a few things. I became fascinated by the birds, and I learned that I had false assumptions about the birds living in our immediate neighborhood. I had thought to myself, oh, all that's around here are just pigeons and starlings and robins and a couple of other small, unremarkable bird types. Well, as I started looking more closely, as I started taking photographs, I quickly discovered that that assumption was being blown out of the water. Now, I've used that term assumption a couple of times here, but what is it? How is this assumption defined? Well, the first and last definitions of assumption from the dictionary I was using are the ones we're interested in. And the first one is a thing that is accepted as true or as certain to happen without proof. And the last definition is arrogance or presumption. Without proof. That's what we want to focus on. We're accepting something as true in ignorance, to put a finer point on it. Without proof, dealing in ignorance. It's not a healthy thing to do. But back to the birds, now that we've got a definition. I was walking through the neighborhood in the local park, and my wife and I have gone to some longer local trails and off to the John Hines Wildlife Refuge, a beautiful place in Philadelphia if you ever get a chance to go there. And we quickly discovered just how wrong my assumption was about the birds in our area. There were a lot of little birds that get dismissed, who aren't what they seem. They get written off as just some sparrows or some chickadees. Well, let's take a look at just sparrows for a moment. What exactly are we talking about? What kind of sparrows? We can look at the European import. There's only one of those. That's the house sparrow. Or, get ready, there are 6 native New World sparrows. The song, grasshopper, chirping, field, savanna, or swamp. So which one are you talking about? The common or the rare? This gaggle of different sparrows is often dismissed with a derisive little term. People write them off as what they call LBJs. And no, they're not calling them Lyndon Baines Johnsons. No. LBJ stands for Little Brown Jobs. It's a way of dismissing whole classes of really interesting birds. Now, there are many people of color who have heard this term and have been angered by this phrase because they recognize that all too well they've been dismissed by negative assumptions and painful terms just like this. Labels have been placed on them with no proof, and they're hurtful, and they're all lumping people together under ignorant assumption. One day, without notice, suddenly all the squirrels and the rabbits in the area, which you see early in the morning, were gone. And I wondered why. And then I saw a big raptor land on top of a telephone pole. Turned out to be a red-tailed hawk that had come to visit our neighborhood. Not what I was writing off as the few boring little birds, to be sure. Now down by Brandywine Creek, I found some of what I expected. Mallard ducks and their ducklings, Canadian geese and their goslings, all incredibly cute. And they have some really interesting interactions with each other when they have young. But I didn't expect to find two great blue herons down there, but I did. And in a recent conversation with one of my neighbors, I discovered that she had heard that there's a nest behind the library in the woods right back there that might be an eagle's nest. That'll be worth a little detour on my next walk, I think. Who knew? And I could go on and on and on about the birds. For instance, let's take some colorful birds that were found on the Trestle Bridge Trail. You're seeing a couple of them here. Like the scarlet tanager. It's got a vivid black body and beautiful red wings. Saw one of those out there. And then I saw a bird. My wife saw it first, and then I saw it, and it's challenging to photograph. It was flying up and down the trunk of the tree. Turns out it was doing what warblers do. It was rousting bugs from leaves so it could eat them. And it was called an American redstart. I'd never heard of an American redstart. Black body with orange and yellow wings and tails. Quite beautiful. Finally, do you ever dismiss raptors out of hands and say they're just crows or vultures? Yeah, I did. Well, I saw a crow one day, and it was early in the morning. The light was coming in at a steep angle, and it looked like sunlight was reflecting off of its wings, creating the illusion of white patches on the ends of its wings. Quite beautiful, so I photographed that as well. I'd been wrong. That wasn't a crow at all. That was a black vulture. Those were the classic markings. White on the underside of the wings for the black vulture. So another assumption is shot down. We're hearing an awful lot of assumptions being tossed around these days about people of various religions, different nationalities, different life circumstances, and it reminded me of this birding experience. All of those assumptions about different people, and people are as different as birds and as varied and fascinating as the birds, are made again in ignorance, not knowing people that we're talking about, but lumping them into categories that we might find useful, but that are infuriating or deeply wounding to the people we're talking about. And those assumptions affect how we interact with other people as well, often to our and their detriment. So, it's something to be avoided. But what does the Bible say? I'm a pastor, so we got to get back to this. What does the Bible have to say about making assumptions? Now, cautionary tale here about this. When you're reading a verse and you intend to use it, make sure you've read the verses all around it first so that you're not misusing the verse to make a point and actually making a very different point than the author originally intended. You've got to check those verses out pretty carefully first. I've done that. And here's a few that I'd like to point out to you. Proverbs 18, verse 2, for instance. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing personal opinion. You got to watch that. And in the same proverb, verse 6, we learn what the consequence of that level of assumption making can be. It reads, a fool's lips bring strife, and a fool's mouth invites a flogging. We got to beware of those nasty assumptions and acting upon them, because the results for us can be quite negative. There's a way to avoid assumptions found in 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test spirits to see if they are from God. Many false prophets have gone out into the world. So I'm going to challenge you today. I want you to test what I have said. Don't assume that I've got this all nailed down, but test it. Go and test my thoughts on assumptions and see if they're true. Accept them with knowledge rather than ignorance. It's a fun challenge. It's an interesting way of facing the world, as a matter of fact, and knowing a great deal more. There's way too much material out there, especially on social media or on cable opinion shows. That's not necessarily true. And we need to check that out so that we don't end up making false assumptions and living by them, which would be tragic. All right. So, there's another admonition against assumptions and the consequences that can come from them. Remember, we have freedom of choice, but we never have freedom from the consequences of the choices we choose to make. And they can be quite negative. So let's look at Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. I think that makes the point about the biblical author's perspectives. I think that's enough for now. We understand that they're not particularly fond of assumptions. We would rather not have them done. And that's good for us and good for the communities we live in. It helps build everybody up. One last assumption on birds was recently dashed with a book I've been reading. I've really gotten fascinated by this. And it's by the very talented author, Jennifer Ackerman. She writes best-selling books on science and nature and human biology. She's really good at what she does. And she's written a book called The Bird Way. I highly recommend it. It's an easy read. And it talks about all the new discoveries about birds that are blowing away old assumptions that have been held for a long time and haven't lived up to the tests and the proofs that have come in recent years. Did you grow up hearing the phrase bird brain? If it was applied to somebody, was bird brain ever a compliment? So, did you know that's based on a faulty assumption as well? We think that birds have got those tiny little heads, so they've got those tiny little brains. Therefore, with tiny brains and tiny heads, they must be tiny intellects. They must be pretty stupid. Well, that assumption is wrong. It's recently been discovered that while we humans have pretty big brains, filled with pretty big neurons that allow us to have pretty big thoughts, birds went in another direction. God is amazing in diversity. So instead of big brains with big neurons, they shrunk those brains down by putting in many, many, many more tiny neurons, smaller neurons packed in more closely together, allowing them to create very efficient tiny computers between those birds' ears. And scientists have discovered that birds are far smarter than we've ever given them credit for. In fact, some birds are rivaling the great apes in intelligence. And they can do things that was once believed only humans could do. For instance, they can communicate across different bird types warnings about approaching predators. And in those warnings, they can tell them whether the predator's flying into the air or coming down from the ground, whether they should be looking up or down, and whether it would be best to flee or to hide under a bush or to mob that opponent to drive them away. That's a lot of information imparted in birdsong. They're a lot more sophisticated than we thought. So if someone calls you bird brain now, you've got to puzzle out whether or not it's a compliment. Finally, I wore this shirt today. You can see it, for a purpose. If you don't know me, particularly if you don't know me, what assumptions have you made based on me wearing this style of shirt? Most likely, those assumptions are wrong. It's worth thinking about. So let's follow Jesus' great commandments instead. They aren't suggestions, they're actual commands. To love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. We love our neighbors and ourselves better by not making assumptions which are based on ignorance. Let's not do it. Let's build each other up instead. It's amazing what can be learned when you go out to watch the birds. And I want you all to have a blessed day and to say stay safe. And we'll talk again soon. So long for now. Bye-bye. Okay.